In a popular psychology study published by Leon Festinger and James Carl-Smith in 1959, participants were tasked with completing a series of boring and monotonous tasks. Afterwards, the students were divided into 3 groups: a control group, which wasn't compensated for their work, and 2 experimental groups, which were tasked with telling the next participant to perform the study that the work was in fact highly engaging and interesting. In other words, they were asked to lie. Of those 2 groups, one was compensated highly for their work and the other was compensated poorly. Then, all participants were asked to rate their personal enjoyment of the intentionally tedious, nonsensical work. There's a few more details to this study that I'm leaving out for the sake of time, but if you're curious, you can find it linked in the description. Now, what's interesting is that while 2 of the groups rated the activity appropriately negatively, that is the unpaid control group, and the highly paid group, which was compensated with $20, the equivalent of about $220 today. But the poorly compensated group, which was awarded with $1, rated the activity positively. The author suggested that the group that wasn't compensated could evaluate the work for what it was, boring and nonsensical, and then the group that was paid $20 could too. After all, if they were paid well to do boring work, and they were asked to lie about it to the next participant, then it can still be worthwhile. It's still worth their $20. But the group that received only $1 had to do some mental gymnastics. The author suggested that this group may have felt conflicted about presenting the tasks as engaging and exciting when they really weren't, but their compensation for doing so wasn't worthwhile either. In experiencing this cognitive dissonance, they convinced themselves that the work really was exciting. Otherwise, why would they be doing it? And hence the positive rating. This study result is a perfect example of rationalization. When you're denied a job application, you might say, well, it wasn't really a good opportunity anyways. When you struggle to get tasks done on time and you procrastinate a lot, you might say, well, I work better under pressure. When you say, I succeeded because I'm talented, but I failed because the system is unfair, this is rationalization. Coming to a conclusion about why something happened first, and then reasoning backwards into why that explanation is justified. Why do we foolish mortal humans rationalize in the first place? Well, rationalization protects self-esteem and ego. It reduces guilt and anxiety. Rationalization allows us to make a decision that isn't in alignment with our values, or in order to avoid some negative feeling like shame or fear, or guilt, anger, worthlessness. For example, rationalizing that a friend needs to learn to solve their own problems in order to cover up the guilt for not helping them. They can help us to cope with a reality that isn't meeting our desires or our expectations. For example, rationalizing that it's just too risky to try a new venture, and so it's better to stay safe and mildly unsatisfied wherever I am at the moment. They can reinforce ideologies to the point of rigidity. For example, rationalizing dismissing a study suggesting the risks of global climate change by assigning a hidden agenda to the scientists who performed the study. And rationalizations can protect our identity against contradicting evidence. For example, rationalizing that I'm intelligent but still performed poorly on a test because it was poorly written. Or rationalizing that I'm kind and respectful, but I snapped at someone because they intentionally went out of their way to provoke me. Notice that when we rationalize, we're coming to a conclusion first and then justifying it. That justification is often logical or rational, but it's not asking a rigorous question. Rationalization wrongly asks, for example, how could this be true, rather than, is it true? Why was this inevitable instead of, was it inevitable? Why wasn't this my fault instead of, what role did I play? Or what different role can I play in the future? Here's the thing, you can rationalize almost anything. Ideologies, conspiracy theories, risky behaviors, judgment of other people's character or motives. We can rationalize our positions on these things in any direction that we want, no matter how inconclusive or unsupported by evidence. Let's say I gamble $1,000 on the roll of a 6-sided die. If it lands on a 6, I double my money. But if it lands on anything else, I lose everything. Now, mathematically, this is a pretty dumb bet. But if I take the gamble and win, I may rationalize it as a smart move. Of course, the outcome was random. There was no way to predict or influence it. But after the fact, we might be tempted to construct a story that makes the gamble seem justified. After all, I won. In reality, we face decisions with messy and inconclusive information, yet we can still rationalize and tell ourselves that the data is more predictive than it actually is, especially in retrospect, when we make a move and interpret the validity of that move later, after the outcome is revealed. In a successful relationship, it might be, for example, my partner and I are so perfect together. And if that relationship fails, well, we had too many incompatibilities. Maybe you know someone who eats poorly but stays thin nonetheless. You can rationalize that observation by saying, well, they're genetically lucky and have a high metabolism. Or you can just as well rationalize it by saying, well, they probably work out frequently and burn a lot of calories. Maybe you're trying to start a business and you're looking to see how other entrepreneurs find success. If your role model becomes a multimillionaire within 2 years, how do you rationalize it? Did they find an unmet need and capitalize on it effectively and intelligently? Or did they just get lucky and just happen to enter the right market at the right time? Notice that in each of these cases, I'm telling a story to explain my observation after the fact. And I can tell any story that I want. You and I can both observe the same thing and yet tell opposing, mutually exclusive stories about what that observation means. This is rationalization. But now you may raise an important question. If we're telling stories that aren't quite true, is rationalization basically the same thing as lying? And it isn't. But the distinction isn't always intuitive. A lie is pointed outward in a conscious attempt to deceive others. But rationalization is often unconscious. Not because we don't know we're doing it, but because we're deceiving ourselves about the intent. When we rationalize, we believe that we're applying logic to deduce truth or meaning. But instead, we're justifying our feelings or our story, or we're reducing uncomfortable uncertainty or creating psychological coherence. In effect, a rationalization is a lie that we tell ourselves about what our observations really mean. The tricky thing is, rationalizing exercises our logical minds. We're really evaluating data and applying causal reasoning. Rationalizations can feel right. They can feel like they make sense. But the application of logic in a rationalization is done with the objective of justifying a decision or a position, not maximizing accuracy or determining truth. This means that, especially when the data is fuzzy or inconclusive, rationalizing encourages us to move forward with a decision already made, even if the reasoning behind it is wrong, rather than getting stuck in uncertainty. So if rationalization is so compelling, if it feels like it makes perfect sense, how do we identify when we're doing it, and then stop doing it? One method is to look at our stories like a scientist. Instead of an explanation or a justification, my rationalized story can be treated as a hypothesis, not as a truth, but a question. And then I can look for disconfirming evidence, just like we would in any scientific experiment. So instead of asking of my story, what evidence supports this, I would ask, how would I prove my story false? And if I do that investigation and am unable to prove it false, then, and only then, can I conclude that it might be true. So there's a lot of really valuable questions that we can ask of our rationalizations to help us dissolve them. Questions like, what evidence would change my mind? What is the evidence that contradicts my story? Why am I justifying dismissing that evidence? What alternative stories could I tell about my observation with equal or greater evidential weight? Can my justification be used to explain alternative explanations too? What's my attachment to this story? Is it a relief? Is it vindication? Or am I truly unattached? What identity am I protecting through this explanation? If someone else told me the same story about their experiences, how would I interpret it? If someone that I don't respect told me the same story, would I agree with them? And am I trying to force certainty and coherence when it really isn't there? And if so, why do I feel like I need to do that? Now, none of this self-questioning guarantees perfect objectivity, nor is that our objective. But pausing for a moment to question our explanations, to apply the same scrutiny to our own stories that we so readily do to the stories of others. This can help us prioritize truth rather than coherence or convenience, and that awareness gives us autonomy over the stories that we tell ourselves about the world. That autonomy of thought is a form of acceptance. Acceptance that truthful conclusions aren't always satisfying, coherent, or certain, and that sometimes it's okay to leave the story unfinished until stronger evidence is available.